12 Stoic lessons that will transform your life in 2026. Stoicism. There is a version of you waiting on the other side of discomfort, a version who does not flinch at criticism, who does not chase approval, who moves through chaos with the calm of a man who has already made peace with everything he cannot control. The Stoics of ancient Rome and Greece spent their lives building toward that version of themselves. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire while writing private notes to himself about restraint. Epictetus, born a slave, taught that freedom has nothing to do with circumstance and everything to do with the mind. Seneca counseled emperors while reminding himself daily that death could arrive before sunset. These men did not have easier lives than you. They had harder ones, and they built a philosophy strong enough to carry them through it. This year does not need to look like the last one. It does not need to be filled with the same hesitation, the same reactivity, the same quiet erosion of discipline that so many men allow to define their days. What follows are 12 lessons drawn from the deepest wells of Stoic thought, lessons that have outlasted empires because they were never dependent on circumstance to remain true. If you want more of this kind of clarity delivered directly to you, subscribe to Quotes Library now, because this channel exists to help you build exactly the kind of mind these lessons describe. Let's begin. Lesson 1. Control what is yours, release what is not. Epictetus opened his teachings with the single most important distinction a man can make, the line between what belongs to him and what does not. Your judgments, your effort, your character, your response to whatever happens, these are yours completely. Other people's opinions, the outcome of your effort, the behavior of the world around you, these were never yours to begin with. Most suffering comes from confusing the two, from gripping tightly to things that were never within your reach and neglecting the one domain that was always entirely under your command. A man who internalizes this distinction stops wasting his energy on outrage over things he cannot change. He stops checking for approval that was never guaranteed. He directs his full strength toward the only battlefield where victory is actually possible, his own mind and conduct. This does not mean he stops caring about outcome. It means he stops confusing effort with entitlement to a particular result. He does the work fully, and then releases his grip on what happens next, because gripping tighter does not change the outcome, it only exhausts the man holding on. This year, practice naming the line before you react to anything. Ask yourself plainly whether what troubles you belongs to your own choices or to the choices and circumstances of the world outside you. This single habit, repeated daily, quietly reorganizes an entire life around what can actually be built rather than what can only be mourned. Lesson 2. Amor fati, love your fate. Nietzsche later borrowed this phrase, but its roots run deep through Stoic soil. The Stoics taught that a wise man does not merely tolerate what happens to him, he learns to want it, to see even hardship as material for growth rather than an obstacle to it. This is not passive resignation. It is an active embrace of reality exactly as it presents itself, without the constant inner argument that things should be different than they are. Consider how much energy is lost to resistance, to the endless inner complaint that circumstances should have gone another way. A delayed flight, a lost opportunity, an unexpected setback, these events themselves cause far less suffering than the mental war waged against their existence. Amor fati asks a man to redirect that energy entirely, to meet whatever arrives, welcome or unwelcome, as exactly the material his character needed to develop further. This does not mean pretending hardship feels good. It means refusing to add a second layer of suffering on top of the first, the layer created entirely by wishing things were otherwise. A man practicing amor fati faces a difficult year not with denial but with a strange, hard-won gratitude, understanding that the very difficulty he faces is the forge in which his strength is actually built. Nothing arrives by accident that cannot also be used. Lesson 3. Memento Mori, remember you will die. The Stoics kept death close, not out of morbidity, but out of clarity. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that he could leave this life at any moment, and he let that awareness shape every decision he made about how to spend the hours he had left. This is not a lesson meant to frighten. It is a lesson meant to cut through the fog of trivial concern that fills most ordinary days, the small irritations, the petty comparisons, the endless postponement of what actually matters in favor of what merely feels urgent. A man who genuinely holds his mortality in view stops wasting his limited hours on grudges that will not matter in a decade, on approval from people whose opinions carry no real weight, on distractions engineered to consume attention without offering anything of substance in return. He begins asking sharper questions of his own life. Is this how I want to have spent today, if today turned out to be among my last? Would this argument matter if I understood, truly, how finite my remaining time actually is? This lesson, practiced honestly, does not produce despair. It produces urgency toward what matters and indifference toward what does not. It clears away the noise that fills a life left unexamined, and leaves behind only the questions that were always worth asking in the first place. Lesson 4. Virtue is the only true good. The Stoics held a position that still unsettles modern ears, the claim that wealth, health, reputation, and comfort are not actually good or bad in themselves. They are what the Stoics called indifference, useful or unfortunate depending on circumstance, but never the true measure of a life well lived. Only virtue, wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance counted as the genuine good, because virtue alone cannot be taken from a man by any external force. This reframes an entire life. A man chasing wealth as his ultimate good will always be vulnerable to its loss. A man chasing reputation will always be hostage to the shifting opinions of a crowd he cannot control. But a man building his character, cultivating courage in the face of fear, wisdom in the face of confusion, justice in the face of temptation to cut corners, is building something no market crash, no scandal, no betrayal can strip from him. This does not mean a man should reject comfort or success when they arrive. It means he should hold them loosely, understanding they were never the point. The point was always the character built along the way, the quiet integrity that remains intact whether the external circumstances are generous or cruel. This is the foundation the Stoics considered unshakable, because it was built from something no outside force could ever repossess. Lesson 5. The obstacle is the way. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way itself. This is one of the most practically useful ideas the Stoics left behind, because it transforms the entire relationship a man has with adversity. Instead of treating obstacles as interruptions to the life he was supposed to be living, he learns to treat them as the actual raw material of that life, the very thing his character was waiting for. A man who loses his job does not simply lose income, he gains an unexpected forge for resilience and reinvention. A man who is betrayed does not simply lose trust, he gains sharpened discernment about who deserves it. This reframing is not about denying pain. It is about refusing to let pain be the final word, insisting instead that every setback carries within it the raw material for a strength that comfort alone could never have produced. This lesson demands a shift in how a man narrates his own life. Instead of asking why this happened to him, he learns to ask what this particular difficulty is now making possible that comfort never would have. This single reframe, repeated across a lifetime of obstacles, slowly builds a man who does not fear adversity, because he has learned, again and again, that adversity is simply where his growth has always come from. If you are halfway through this list and already feeling the shift in how you see your own year, subscribe to Quotes Library now, because the remaining lessons dig even deeper into the discipline that turns philosophy into an actual transformed life. The story of Adais and the broken wheel. There was a woman named Adais who ran a small trading business in a busy market town. For years, everything had gone smoothly, her cart well stocked, her customers loyal, her days predictable. Then one morning, on the way to market, the wheel of her cart cracked and gave out entirely, spilling her goods across the road. She sat there, watching passers-by step around her scattered merchandise, and felt something close to despair. An old trader named Baba Chukwu, who had watched the market for decades, walked over and helped her gather what remained. He did not offer sympathy first. Instead he asked her a question. He asked whether she had ever, in all her years of smooth trading, learned how to repair a cartwheel herself. She admitted she had not, because she had never needed to. Baba Chukwu smiled and told her that the wheel had broken exactly where her weakness had been hiding all along, unexamined, because comfort had never forced her to examine it. Adais spent the following weeks learning to repair and reinforce her own equipment, something she had always paid others to handle. It was frustrating, slow work, filled with small failures before she finally understood the mechanics well enough to trust her own hands. But by the time the next difficult season arrived, a season of storms that damaged carts across the entire market, Adais was one of the only traders whose cart survived intact, because she had already learned what the others were only now being forced to learn. She often thought back to that morning on the road, the scattered goods, the despair she had felt watching her plans fall apart. She came to understand that the wheel had not broken to punish her. It had broken to prepare her, and the preparation would never have come any other way. What had felt like the worst morning of her season turned out to be the exact obstacle that saved her the following one. Lesson 6. Guard your reactions, not just your actions. The Stoics taught that between an event and a man's response to it lies a small but decisive gap, and that gap is where a man's entire character is either built or wasted. Most men live as though their reactions are automatic, as though anger, offense, or panic are simply forced upon them by circumstance. The Stoics insisted otherwise. They taught that the initial impression of an event is not within a man's control, but what he does with that impression, the story he tells himself about it, the response he chooses to build from it, is entirely his own. This distinction matters enormously in practice. A man cut off in traffic does not have to become an angry man for the next hour. A man criticized publicly does not have to spiral into shame for the rest of the day. The event itself passes in seconds. What extends the suffering is the story a man tells himself afterward, replayed and amplified long after the original moment has ended. Guarding this gap, the space between stimulus and response, is one of the most practical disciplines a Stoic can build. This year, practice pausing in that gap before reacting to anything that stings. Ask what story you are about to tell yourself about what just happened, and whether that story serves you or simply feeds a spiral you did not need to enter. This single pause, cultivated patiently over time, becomes the difference between a man ruled by his circumstances and a man who rules his own inner world regardless of what circumstances arrive. Lesson 7. Speak less, observe more. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, reportedly said that nature gave men 2 ears and 1 mouth so that they might listen more than they speak. This was not merely a rule of etiquette. It reflected a deeper Stoic conviction that most speech in ordinary company is reactive, unexamined, offered before a man has actually thought through what he believes. A man who speaks constantly rarely has the space to notice what is actually happening around him, the patterns, the openings, the quiet signals that a more observant man would catch. Restraint in speech builds 2 things simultaneously. It sharpens a man's perception, because attention that is not spent formulating the next sentence is instead spent genuinely observing the room. And it protects a man's opinions from being scattered carelessly to people who will neither value nor remember them. The Stoics believed that words, like any resource, lose their weight when spent too freely, and gain weight precisely in proportion to how rarely and deliberately they are offered. This does not mean silence for its own sake. It means speech that has been tested against genuine reflection before it leaves a man's mouth. Practicing this discipline, even for a single season, tends to reveal how much of ordinary conversation was filler, offered out of nervous habit rather than genuine conviction. What remains, once the filler is removed, is speech that actually carries the weight of a mind that has done its work before offering its conclusion. Lesson 8. Prepare for adversity before it arrives. Seneca practiced a discipline the Stoics called premeditatio malorum, the deliberate rehearsal of hardship before it occurs. He would imagine, in advance, the loss of wealth, status, or comfort, not to invite misfortune, but to strip it of its power to shock him when it eventually arrived. A man who has already imagined the worst outcome and found a way to remain steady within it is far less likely to be destabilized when reality delivers something similar. This practice runs against modern instinct, which tends to treat any contemplation of hardship as pessimism to be avoided. The Stoics saw it differently. They believed that refusing to consider adversity in advance does not protect a man from it, it only ensures he faces it unprepared when it inevitably comes. Premeditation is not about living in fear of loss. It is about removing fear's grip entirely, by having already walked, in the mind, through the very scenarios that fear most likes to threaten a man with. This year, spend a few quiet minutes considering what you would do if your greatest current source of security disappeared entirely. Not to dwell there, but to discover that even in that scenario, a path forward exists, and your character would remain intact. This exercise, uncomfortable as it is, tends to produce a strange and durable calm, the calm of a man who has already faced his fears in the safety of his own mind and found them smaller than he expected. There is a further benefit to this practice that Seneca noted often: the way rehearsed adversity sharpens gratitude for what has not yet been lost. A man who has genuinely imagined the absence of his health, his relationships, or his security tends to return from that exercise with a renewed appreciation for what remains intact today. Premeditation, done honestly, does not just prepare a man for loss, it also restores his attention to the goods he has been taking for granted in the meantime. Lesson 9. Judge yourself by your own standard. The Stoics warned repeatedly against measuring a life by comparison to others, understanding that comparison is an endless and ultimately meaningless race, since there will always be someone further ahead and someone further behind. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself to focus entirely on whether his own conduct matched his own principles, regardless of how his peers were living or what they had accomplished. This internal standard, rather than an external ranking, was the only meaningful measure of a well-lived life. A man who measures himself against others will always be at the mercy of circumstances entirely outside his control, the timing of someone else's success, the visibility of someone else's struggle, the curated appearance of lives he only glimpses from a distance. A man who measures himself against his own principles is instead accountable only to something he can actually influence, whether today's conduct matched what he genuinely believes a good life requires. This shift removes an enormous and unnecessary weight. It replaces the anxious question of how a man is doing relative to everyone else with the far more useful question of whether he is living in alignment with his own deepest convictions. This is the only comparison the Stoics considered worth making, and it is available to every man, regardless of what circumstances surround him, because it depends entirely on standards he alone gets to set and uphold. Lesson 10. Treat time as your only true wealth. Seneca wrote extensively about how carelessly men spend the one resource they can never recover, their time, while guarding money and possessions with far greater vigilance. He observed that men who would never allow a stranger to walk off with their savings will hand over entire afternoons, evenings, and years to distractions and obligations that offer nothing of lasting value in return. This carelessness, he argued, was the true poverty most men suffered from, not a lack of money, but a lack of attention to the only currency that could never be replenished. This lesson demands an audit most men avoid. It asks a man to actually examine where his hours are going, how much is spent on genuine growth, meaningful relationship, and deliberate rest, and how much simply disappears into habits that offer nothing back. Seneca believed most men discover, when they finally conduct this audit honestly, that a shocking fraction of their life has been spent on activities they cannot even clearly remember, consumed without intention and without lasting return. This year, treat your calendar the way a careful steward treats a limited inheritance. Protect the hours that build something durable: character, skill, relationship, understanding. Guard against the hours that quietly vanish into distraction, offering the momentary relief of escape but nothing that remains once the moment has passed. Time spent this deliberately becomes the truest wealth a man can accumulate, because unlike money, it cannot be replaced once it has gone. Seneca made a point of noting that men rarely regret the years spent on genuine effort, even when that effort failed to produce the outcome hoped for. What men regret, almost universally, near the end of their days, is the time spent numb, distracted, or waiting for a life that never quite began. This regret is avoidable, but only by a man willing to treat his hours today with the seriousness he would want to have treated them with in retrospect, before retrospect becomes the only vantage point left available to him. Lesson 11. Justice toward others is justice toward yourself. The Stoics considered justice one of the four cardinal virtues, and they understood it not merely as a legal principle but as a daily discipline of fair dealing with every person a man encountered. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire, still reminded himself constantly to treat even those who wronged him with fairness rather than cruelty, understanding that his own character was shaped far more by how he treated others than by how they treated him. A man who cuts corners in his dealings with others is not merely harming them, he is corroding the very character he is supposedly trying to protect. This lesson challenges the modern instinct toward self-interest disguised as strategy, the belief that a man must sometimes act unjustly in order to secure his own advantage. The Stoics rejected this framing entirely. They believed that injustice toward others always produces injustice within the man committing it, a subtle but real erosion of the integrity he needs intact if he wants to remain steady under pressure. Fair dealing, even when inconvenient, protects something far more valuable than the short-term advantage it sacrifices. This year, treat every transaction, every disagreement, every negotiation as an opportunity to practice justice rather than simply extract advantage. Not out of naivety, but out of a clear understanding that a man's fairness toward others is inseparable from the strength of his own character, and that character, once compromised for a shortcut, does not repair itself easily once the shortcut has been taken. There is also a quieter dimension to this lesson that the Stoics understood well: the way small daily fairness compounds into a reputation a man does not need to defend, because it defends itself. A man known for fair dealing does not need to convince others of his integrity in every new encounter. His history speaks before he does. This is not the same as the hollow popularity chased by men seeking approval. It is something sturdier, trust built slowly and correctly, the kind that survives scrutiny because it was never manufactured for appearance in the first place. Lesson 12. Build the habit, not just the insight. The final and perhaps most important Stoic lesson is that none of the previous 11 mean anything without daily practice. The Stoics were relentlessly practical philosophers, uninterested in insight that never translated into conduct. Epictetus warned his students directly against becoming men who could recite philosophy beautifully while living exactly as undisciplined as before they had studied it. Understanding a principle intellectually and living by it consistently are two entirely different achievements, and only the second one actually transforms a life. This is why the Stoics built daily disciplines around their philosophy rather than treating it as an occasional inspiration. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journal nightly, reviewing his conduct honestly against his principles. Seneca corresponded constantly with friends, holding each other accountable to the philosophy they claimed to follow. These were not casual hobbies. They were structured practices designed to close the gap between what a man believed and how he actually lived, a gap that widens quickly in anyone who treats philosophy as entertainment rather than daily training. This year, choose one lesson from everything covered here and build a genuine daily practice around it, however small. Insight without repetition fades within days. Insight married to consistent practice becomes character within a year. The Stoics did not become who they were through a single powerful realization. They became who they were through the relentless, unglamorous repetition of principle into habit, day after day, until the philosophy was no longer something they studied, but simply who they were. This is the difference between a man who can quote Marcus Aurelius at a dinner party and a man who actually rises each morning and asks himself, honestly, whether his conduct yesterday matched the standard he claims to hold. The first man has collected interesting ideas. The second man is quietly becoming someone new, one ordinary day at a time, in a way no dinner conversation could ever capture but every difficult year will eventually reveal. Closing reflection. 12 lessons cannot transform a life on their own. They are only the beginning, a map handed to a man who still has to walk the actual terrain. But a map matters enormously to a man who has been walking blind, and these lessons, tested across centuries by men who faced empires, exile, slavery, and death with remarkable steadiness, offer exactly the kind of orientation most men are searching for without knowing where to look. If Adaisa's story reminded you of your own broken wheel, some obstacle that felt like ruin but might actually be preparation, let this year be the one where you finally pick up the tools instead of waiting for smoother roads. Return to these lessons often. Practice them badly before you practice them well. This is exactly the kind of transformation quotes library exists to support, so if this reached something in you, subscribe now and let this channel walk alongside you as you build the steadier, stronger mind these lessons describe. Keep becoming.